apologize, I have a sore throat, so if you don't hear me very good, I have a soft voice but a strong opinion, and I hope we'll manage. When Frank asked me to speak to you here on the Eurozone crisis, I didn't know whether it's a good idea, because I have the impression that Angela Merkel is not very well received within these days in Europe. But don't worry, my opinion on her is as well not very high. But I was afraid you might be throwing stones at me. I've seen a lot of militant engineers in here. But I could see nobody brought stones, so I hope we have a very lively but peaceful debate. First of all, if you talk about economic subjects, my first advice to you is don't listen to the economists. Listen to your common sense. And particularly, I am an economist, but I hope what I will tell you makes some sense to you. When you listen to economists these days, and you listen especially to German economists, you will hear that the crisis we are currently experiencing is a crisis because people in Ireland, and Greece and Spain have lived beyond their means, and that's, in my opinion, bluntly bullshit. My grandfather, an Italian peasant, he was not very well educated, he was not an economist. He used to say that the devil always shits in the same corner, which basically meant that the richest get richer and the poorer get poorer. And I think he understood more about economics than many of these trained economists nowadays. But I will give you 2 or 3 main arguments what, in my perspective, this Eurozone crisis is about. First of all, we have to remember the Euro crisis is an offspring of the economic crisis in 2008. And what is the core of this economic crisis? I don't know who of you was listening yesterday to Fred Magdorf, who had a very interesting speech given here. And he showed that basically we have one development in all major industrialized countries, which is that workers, those dependent on a wage income, get less of the pie since years. So the percentage of wages relative to national income has decreased in most industrialized countries. So it's very awkward to argue that the majority of the people has lived beyond the means, first of all. Second of all, he showed how financial engineering developed and how we got into this financial crisis. And in my eyes, it's not enough to say, okay, financial markets have been deregulated, we have stripped the rules, and so on. I think that this crisis is basically a crisis of distribution, a crisis of, how Fred put it yesterday, of class warfare from the upper class leveraged against the working class. Because this whole debt system and how it works has its roots in this fact that workers get less of the pie. Why is that so? It's very simple. If people get less of the pie and they can't afford to buy as many goods and services, there are more, each year more goods and services produced, and they get less of the pie, then business has a problem. They can't sell their goods and services. So the solution in capitalist societies to this problem is credit. You provide credit. So you provide credit to those workers where you're not willing to pay them a decent wage. And this is the very core of the crisis, and I think this is the very core of the explanation why we had this dynamic development of financial markets. Now, there was a slide shown by Fred yesterday where you could see that the debt of financial business has risen a lot through the last years. And then you could see from the crisis from 2008 on, it fell again. And at the same time, you could see that public debt was increasing. So there is some sort of relationship between the debts of the financial business and public debt. And what happened, we can see very clearly here in Ireland, is that the state has taken over debt by financial business. So if Angela Merkel today says Ireland has lived beyond its means, I'm wondering why she never said financial business has lived beyond its means in the years prior to the crisis. Because if you look at the figures, Ireland had a public debt to GDP ratio of 25%, I think, prior to the crisis, roughly 25%. But banks had accumulated debt in relationship to GDP of 450%. And now what happened is very straightforward. Banks decreased their debts, and public debts in Ireland have risen from 25 to 100%. So it is too simple if economists argue public authorities have recklessly spent money. Ireland is a very good example of a state who had a very sound public budget. I'm not talking about tax policies and other stuff where I would argue that taxes on business, on the corporate sector have to be high in Ireland, no doubt about that. But my basic argument is that it's not true that this euro crisis is stemming from public authorities recklessly spending money. Another example would be Spain. Spain had 35% public debts to GDP. It has risen significantly since then. And these figures were lower than in Germany, and everybody's saying, oh yeah, Germany has very sound economic policies and so on. So when we're talking about debts with regard to economic policy, we have to keep in mind that there are three sectors in an economy. It's private households, the companies, and the public authorities. And wherever you have debts, some other people make money. Like an economy is, if you imagine a closed economy, if you owe somebody something, somebody else gets something. So you can't talk about public debt without talking even about private riches. And in the same time that people are arguing we have to reduce public debts, then you also have to argue to look at the private sector and what is happening with the private sector. And part of my argument, what this euro crisis is about, is that it is a crisis of debt, but it's not specifically a crisis of public debt. Because in Spain you had very low public debts, but very high private debts. And I will try to show where these debts come from. As you know, we had fiscal stimulus programs during the economic crisis. We rescued banks, and now public debts have gone up. And some people argued that, yeah, this crisis is different from the 1930s because we are more pragmatic. We spend money and we stabilize the economy and so on and so on. But I think my main argument is this crisis has not even begun yet. Because the real response of the political elites is coming now. We see it with all the austerity measures throughout Europe. And if you look at Greece, for example, Greece was told to cut their public expenditure until 2014 by 13% of GDP, which is roughly, if you compare to the German economy, it would mean a complete public budget. No more policemen on the street, no more fire workers, not in 1 year, but this is what is happening until 2014. And what was the reaction? The reaction was clear that the GDP of Greece shrank by 5% and debts were rising, not falling. And why is that so? It's very straightforward. If the majority of the people is already in debtness and can't spend money anymore, and the corporate sector is not investing anymore because people don't spend money, and then even the state is putting a foot on the brake, then the economy is crumbling. And this is what will happen now in Europe, because everybody is trying to cut back public expenses. And the German government has been very outspoken on this and said, yeah, this is what all of Europe needs to do, because we did the same and look at us, we are very successful with it. But the problem is, if everybody does that at the same time, nothing's gonna work anymore. And I think that this German policy of slashing wages and slashing public expenditure has been one of the core reasons of this crisis. I want to explain why. So I said that this crisis is not basically a crisis of public debt, it's a crisis of the whole indebtedness of certain economies, including the private sector and the corporate sectors. Where do these debt come from? It's a very straightforward point. If you look at the introduction of the euro, like in most of the economies throughout the eurozones, wages were rising a little bit, not much, but they were rising at least. In Germany, one of the biggest economies of the eurozone, or the biggest economy of the eurozone, wages have effectively, real wages have fallen throughout the last years. So if you look at wages today in Germany, they are nearly 5% lower in real terms, adjusted after prices, inflation, than 10 years ago. So workers have less in the pocket today than they had 10 years ago. They work 10 years for nothing. And they are worse off. And what happens if you have a common currency and one country is persistently living below its means and slashing wages? It's very straightforward. If you have such a situation, a country will sell more goods to its neighboring countries than it will buy from them because it's cheaper, it's more competitive. And this is what happened in Germany. Germany accumulated a huge surplus in exports. And if I sell to Frank a lot of products, but I never buy from him, Frank will have a problem one day. He will owe me a lot of money. And this is what exactly happened in the Eurozone. And so our basic argument as political left in Germany is that in order to resolve this crisis, we have to raise wages in Germany, so that even Germany is importing more goods from Ireland, from Spain, from Greece, from other countries. So my second argument would be that you can't have a common currency and completely different development of wages. Economists label this process of having lower wages in other countries a real devaluation, because you don't have the exchange rate anymore. You don't devalue your money, but you're more competitive in real terms. And so it's very interesting that if you listen to German economists, they are very, very quick in pointing to China and saying, oh, the Chinese are devaluing their currency and they are fixing it at a very low value in order to be more competitive, and that's against the free markets, and that's very evil. But the German government does exactly the same in real terms. So I think that a very major part of solution to this crisis lies in Germany. I don't want to discuss the question here whether Ireland should exit the euro or not. That's up to you. I'm not here to lecture the Irish people about what they should do. One might argue that if Ireland had still its own national money, it might have defended itself better against German wage dumping or whatever. But in my opinion, this is not the core of the question. Because in the end, even if all these economies had their own currencies and they would devalue in order to defend themselves, we would be, in the long run, at the same point. Everybody would devalue and no one would be better off. So I think the real question is not about exchange rates and all that stuff. The real question is about class struggle. The real question is about whether workers achieve higher wages. And this is not to argue that Ireland would have been maybe better off with its own currency. I don't know. We're discussing this extensively now in Germany with the relationship to Greece. And even the Greek left has some debates evolving around that. And the problem is, you know, if Greece will exit the euro now, they would even have higher debts because the debts are even still denominated in euros. And then you could argue, okay, simply don't repay these debts as Argentina did. But this is a very complicated procedure Because Argentina, for example, they had capital controls. So they just said, okay, let's impose capital controls, and then we can boost our economy by very low interest rates, and we are not anymore vulnerable to the financial markets. We will stabilize our currency by these capital controls. These are all things one might think of. But the problem is that these capital controls are not allowed in the European Union, according to the European treaties. So there are a lot of other things we would have to discuss if we think about exiting the euro. But that's your debate, and I just wanted to give you a rough idea. So what are the solutions that the German left proposes in accordance to that crisis? Look, there are three major things we're currently discussing. First of all, if one is talking about public debt, we have to talk about private wealth. Because, as I said in the beginning, there's no debt without somebody getting money. You owe to somebody. And I don't know the figures in Ireland, but in Germany it's very straightforward. You have 2 trillion euros of public debt, but you have 8 trillion euros of private wealth, net private wealth, like adjusted for all debts and everything. So 4 times the public debts, and it's highly concentrated. Like 10% of the population have roughly 60% of it, so it's not the majority of the population. So we certainly say if you want to bring your house in order and you want to reduce public debt, you have to tax the rich. That's very straightforward. And I looked up the figures for Europe. In Europe, you have a net private money wealth of roughly, in the Eurozone only, of 12 trillion euros, and you have a public debt of around 8 trillion euros. So private wealth is much more than public debt. So apparently some people were making a lot of money when a state got into debt and during the crisis. The second point we're discussing, we have a very awkward situation right now. So we save the banks with our money, and we run into debts. And what are the banks doing now? The banks are going to the ECB, they're borrowing money at, I don't know, 1.5%, and then they're lending it back to us. But we saved them. And they're lending it back to us at very high rates. And this is ridiculous. So one of our proposals is to say, why can't we say instead the ECB is providing very low interest rates to these states directly, without going via the commercial banks? Why should they even make money on public debt? And there are a lot of economists who will tell you, oh, that's very evil, and we will see inflation and governments recklessly spending. But I think this is not true. Why have the financial managers fared better than states? Did they really manage our money better than public authorities? And we are not at the brink of inflation right now. I mean, prices have risen for foodstuff and things everywhere. This has a lot to do with speculation. But if you look at average inflation, now we've seen large cutbacks, austerity measures. So I think the opposite will happen. Prices will fall because people don't have money to spend right now. So this is a second proposal we are currently tabling with regard to the crisis. But the third and most important proposal from our side is that German workers have to fight for higher wages. And I always tell, when the German people are right now told they're paying for the Irish, for the Greek, for the Portuguese, for the Spain people, because the Greek people were lying under the olive tree and having a good time and things like that. This is basically what the right-wing press is trying to tell the German workers in order to distract them from the real causes of the crisis. But that's not true. The Euro rescue measure is not in order to save you or to save the Greeks or whoever. It's to save the French and the British and the German banks who own the public bonds. So what I usually tell my German fellows is you're not paying for Frank or for anybody. You're paying for Josef Ackermann, who's the CEO of the German bank. And I think this is a very relevant point for all of us, and this is the message. Whether we are Irish, we are German, we are French, we are Italian, we should get out to the people in order to defend ourselves against this class war, which has certainly been leveraged against us. So let me first conclude by that, and then maybe we can, in the discussion later, we can single out certain points and further discuss about that, and whether Ireland should stick to that money or different money. But let me close here, and maybe we can then go into more depth in the debate. Thank you very much.